Hello, everybody everywhere. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. A vignette of 1941, the year Monty Woolley made The Man Who Came to Dinner. And 1941 was the year that Quentin Reynolds produced a bitter but timely recording addressed to Hitler called Dear Mr. S. The Old Scotchman Scrapbook recaptures that moment as Quentin Reynolds talks to Hitler.
How I love the kisses of Dolores. I, Dolores.
1941, the hit song of the year, Dolores.
Only my Dolores.
1941. Death at 53 overtook Amy Semple McPherson, who had introduced a bit of the Mae West atmosphere to the Tabernacle a quarter century before. Also dead in 1941 was Wendell Willkie, shortly after being appointed chairman of the board of 20th Century Fox. 1941. William L. Sharer's great book, Berlin Diary, was still a bestseller. And in this year of 1941, columnist and correspondent Quentin Reynolds struck a personal blow of his own against Adolf Hitler. Reynolds boosted morale with these words to Dear Mr. Schicklgruber.
My dear Mr. Schicklgruber, it is much better to use the name which was yours until you changed it to Hitler long before the last war. In fact, Mr. Schicklgruber, it might be a wise move on your part to change back. No one can really be angry at anyone named Schicklgruber. And so many people are really angry at the name Hitler. Do you think that you have really made the people of Germany believe that their wretched life is paradise? That's all, Mr. S. Yet one more word. Do you think for a moment that a man bearing the name of Winston Churchill will ever bend his knee to anyone named Schicklgruber? Really, Mr.
Quentin Reynolds to Adolf Hitler in 1941. The year that someone told Eddie Cantor he was working too hard and reminded Cantor that he couldn't take it with him. Overhearing this, Georgia Jessel spoke up and said, if Cantor can't take it with him, he'll never go. In a moment, word of the next vignette. This has been a vignette of Quentin Reynolds in 1941 from the Old Scotchman Scrapbook. 1941, the year that Joseph Pinter, better known as Joe Penner, died at the age of 36. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. Listen for the next vignette in the voice of Harry Hopkins. Hello, everybody everywhere. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. When the New Deal came to power, there was a controversial figure always by the side of Franklin Roosevelt. His man Friday Harry Hopkins. In a moment, the Old Scotchman Scrapbook brings you some memories of the voice of Harry Hopkins in 1941. First, it is the year 1930. A big song of 1930 was I'm Yours. (1930). The talking pictures had knifed heavily into the ranks of the stars of the silent screen in 1930. Among those silent stars who had fallen by the wayside because of poor voices were John Gilbert, William Haynes, and Ramon Navarro. Navarro retired to a monastery for quite a time to get over the shock. And death took many of the greatest of the entertainment great in the 30s. Metro's great production genius, Irving Thalberg, died at 37. John Gilbert died at 38. Marilyn Miller at 38. And in 1940, Tom Mix died in an automobile accident at 69. And in the 30s, there was an important political voice, closer, perhaps, to Franklin Roosevelt than any other single man, Harry Hopkins. Here, from the 30s, Hopkins defends the New Deal's WPA plan.
If, for example, I support my party and its program out loud, I am coercing WPA workers. This claim is so absurd that, save for its constant repetition by the opposition, it would not deserve an answer.
And just prior to Pearl Harbor, Harry Hopkins came to England to promise America's cooperation with Britain.
Hitler is seriously threatening this heritage of ours, a heritage which is yours. I did not come from America alone. I came in a bomber plane, and with me were 20 other bombers made in America. These airplanes tonight may be dropping bombs on Brest, on Hamburg, on Berlin, helping to safeguard our common heritage. I came here as a representative of the President of the United States.
That was the voice of Franklin Roosevelt's friend and political advisor, Harry Hopkins, in the 30s, promising aid to Great Britain in its crisis. In a moment, word of the next vignette. From the Old Scotchman Scrapbook has come a vignette of Harry Hopkins in those perilous days before the hordes from the land of the rising sun attack at Pearl Harbor. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. Keep tuned for the next vignette and the Nazi stormtroopers of Adolf Hitler. Hello, everybody everywhere. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. It is the year 1941. The German war machine is at its peak. All Europe is German. The Mediterranean is a Nazi lake. And in a moment, the Old Scotchman Scrapbook presents an unforgettable vignette of the ominous ode of the Nazi stormtroopers.
shadow steal across my
It is 1941, and one of the top tunes of the year is I Think of You.
I think of you.
1941. It had long been thought that Fanny Bryce had no nerves and no worries. But this year, Fanny had a heart attack and was raced by ambulance to a Los Angeles hospital. When friends arrived to visit her the next day, expecting to find her in critical condition, Fanny was in an oxygen tent all right, but with a racing form and a telephone placing bets on tracks all over the country, and had already had 2 winners. In 1941, the last and most colorful of the Gas House Gang was gone from the big league diamond, Jerome Herman Dizzy Dean. Once, while Dean was pitching for the St. Louis Cardinals, a batter hit a line drive that bounced off Dizzy's skull and knocked him unconscious. Doctors were unable to discover any trace of a concussion. The next day, one St. Louis paper carried a headline which read, "Dean's head shows nothing." Even Dizzy's method of leaving the major leagues was unusual and colorful. In an all-star game, outfielder Earl Averill hit a line drive which fractured Dean's toe, and after that, Dizzy could never again regain his pitching skill. But across the seas in 1941, there was no baseball, only the grim realities of sodden trenches and barrage balloons, and Nazi stormtroopers who were the pride of the Third Reich. Next to murder, the best talent of the SS was singing. We turned the recording machine of history back again, back to 1941, as Hitler's crack SS elite guard sings of its prowess. The singing is that of the Nazi stormtroopers, the brown uniformed pride of Adolf Hitler, terror of all Europe. In a moment, word of the next vignette. The Old Scotchman Scrapbook has presented a vignette of one of the most discordant notes in the history of sound, the singing of the Nazi stormtroopers. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. Keep tuned for the next vignette as Alexander Wolcott and George M. Cohan speak during the election of 1940. Hello, everybody everywhere. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. 1940. And in America's hearts was the fear that war was not far distant. The big question, though, was who would lead the country into the war? Roosevelt? Wilkie? In a moment, a vignette of Alexander Wolcott and George M. Cohan commenting on the election of 1940 from the Old Scotchman Scrapbook. First, it is the year 1917. And a fast, big number of the year was Tiger Rag. 1917. An era dazzling as the morning sun passed in America with the death of an era, Diamond Jim Brady. Diamond Jim, who was fond of presenting his guests with little souvenirs to take home, little knickknacks like diamond brooches or diamond watches worth $1,000 apiece. Diamond Jim, who ate a 15-course dinner every night, then a pound of chocolates and a box of peppermints. When Diamond Jim Brady underwent an operation, doctors discovered that he had a stomach 6 times the normal size. And in 1940, America had another personality as fabulous in his wit as Diamond Jim had been in his wealth, Alexander Wolcott. Wolcott, the famed town crier, who spent several years before his death choosing epitaphs for his tombstone and finally settled on the engraving, "After all, he wasn't such a bad chap." And in 1940, the race between Roosevelt and Wilkie was on, and Alexander Wolcott had this to say of the race.
This is Wolcott speaking, the town crier on the air again for one last word. This fortunate land? Oh, yes. We've been very lucky, and never more so than in this, that we have right now in the White House a man who, like Winston Churchill, can put into words what is in all our hearts.
There was another entertainer who took a different view of the Roosevelts in that election, the veteran George M. Cohan. He began by talking about Mrs. Roosevelt's column.
I read in the paper the other day, I was reading Mrs. Roosevelt's column, so you can see that I give the papers an awful reading.
George M. Cohan during the election campaign of 1940, a hard and bitter one. Roosevelt was busy with the country's rearmament and made few speeches, never mentioned his opponent's name. Wilkie toured the country, was hit by eggs in Chicago. In a moment, word of the next vignette. This has been a vignette of Alexander Wolcott and George M. Cohan in the year 1940. The year that Earl Browder ran for president on the communist ticket and was totally ruined by the Hitler-Stalin agreement. This is the old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. Keep tuned for the next vignette and the famed humorist Irvin S. Cobb. Hello, everybody everywhere. This is the old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. It is 1940, the year of that memorable presidential race between the barefoot boy from Wall Street, Wendell Wilkie, and Franklin Roosevelt. In a moment, a vignette from the old Scotchman scrapbook of Irvin S. Cobb commenting on that election. First, it is 1920. A big song of the year is Bye Bye Blackbirds.
Here I go singing low, bye bye blackbird.
1920. One man in New York had the telephone numbers of more beautiful girls than any other man living. His name was Florin Ziegfeld. In Ziegfeld's Blue Book of Beauty, were listed the names, addresses, and telephone numbers of 10,000 beautiful women. Just as some people are addicted to making long-distance telephone calls, Ziegfeld loved to send telegrams. He actually would sit in the orchestra pit during rehearsals and send telegrams to the actors across the footlights. Yet the genius Ziegfeld had no sense of humor. None of his great comedians, Wynne, Cantor, or Rogers, could make him so much as crack a smile. Ziegfeld, who lost everything in the 1929 stock market crash and died broke in California in 1932. In his final delirium, Flo Ziegfeld dreamed that he was directing a new revue. One of Ziegfeld's best friends was Irvin S. Cobb, who survived Flo and lived to see the election of 1940, a bitter battle between the immortal amateur Wendell Willkie and Franklin Roosevelt. From the Old Scotchman scrapbook, the beloved humorist Irvin S. Cobb tells the American people who he's for between Willkie and Roosevelt.
I'm a Democrat, and in that statement is my reason and my boast and my pride that this year I shall vote a straight Democratic ticket. I shall vote for every Democrat running for state or local office in my voting precinct, and for president, I shall vote for the only Democrat running for president this year under any party emblem whatsoever. You guessed it. I'm going to vote for a man named Wendell Willkie.
Irvin S. Cobb in 1940, the year the New York Yankees center fielder Joe DiMaggio set a record in baseball when he hit safely in 56 consecutive games. In a few seconds, there'll be word of the next vignette. This has been a vignette of Irvin S. Cobb on the election of 1940. The year, in the Old Scotchman scrapbook, that Charles Lindbergh, Kathleen Norris, and Norman Thomas headed the America First Committee with the policy of no aid to the Allies. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. Listen for the next vignette as Wendell Willkie campaigns. Hello, everybody everywhere. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. 1940. And Franklin Roosevelt had decided to run for a third term against the best advice of his Democratic teammates, John Nance Garner and James Farley. His opposition was to be a man who gave the Old Scotchman scrapbook of 1940 some of its most vivid moments, the immortal amateur Wendell Willkie. First, 1931. America was humming the Cuban love song. 1931. Bing Crosby went on CBS this year and started to whistle with his songs over the network, but was stopped by CBS because another CBS star, Morton Downey, had started the whistling technique first and didn't like Crosby copying him. 1933. and the Texaco fire chief, Ed Wynn, decided to give the two national radio networks some competition. So Ed Wynn threw in nearly $250,000 and organized a new broadcasting network called the Affiliated Broadcasting System, which had 6 stations and 27 sponsors. And in 1933, Lillian Harvey, star of the picture George White's Scandals, had a row with White and walked out, whereupon George White, in desperation at the last moment, called upon a completely unknown girl extra to fill in for Lillian. The young girl's name was Alice Faye, and it was the beginning of her meteoric career. But the top movie personality of 1933 was not Alice Faye, but a surprise winner, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was being called the Barrymore of the White House. However, Lionel Barrymore, a New Deal enemy, said he didn't appreciate the slur on his household. 7 years later, in 1940, the Barrymore of the White House, seeking an unprecedented third term, faced another magnetic political figure, the barefoot boy from Wall Street, Wendell Willkie, in a fiery campaign. Now, from the Old Scotchman scrapbook of 1940, Willkie strikes out at Roosevelt.
This is the scourge of government above the people, without the people, and in spite of the people.
And Wendell Lewis Willkie had this also to say of the administration.
At this particular crisis in their history, the New Deal Party captured the Democratic Convention at Chicago. It went through a transparent rigmarole about drafting a candidate for president.
There was little difference between Willkie and Roosevelt on foreign policy. Both declared their opposition to a foreign war, little realizing how close we were. In a moment, word of the vignette to come. The Old Scotchman scrapbook has turned its pages to a vignette of Wendell Willkie in 1940. The year I Am an American Day was proclaimed on May 3rd by an act of Congress. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. Keep tuned for the next vignette as Franklin Roosevelt gives his famous speech on the 4 freedoms. Hello, everybody everywhere. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. The year 1940, a year of election at home and political gangsterism abroad. From the Old Scotchman scrapbook of the year 1940 comes the strong voice of Franklin Roosevelt informing the world of America's 4 freedoms. During the hot, humid month of May 1940, Americans could still kid about the war over there. This was 1940, and in one of the hottest races of his career, with Wendell Willkie, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was re-elected President of the United States for the 3rd time. Now, from the Old Scotchman scrapbook, Roosevelt speaks to the world as though in warning of America's 4 freedoms.
In the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world.
That was Franklin Roosevelt in a year of fear, 1940. But Americans at home were still unconcerned. That same year, an indignant citizen wrote a letter to the New York Times protesting that low-flying planes from LaGuardia Field were spoiling his enjoyment of the summer's stadium concerts. In a moment, word of the next vignette. This has been a vignette of 1940, the same year that Congress passed a bill providing a $500 fine and 6 months imprisonment for shooting a bald eagle. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. Keep tuned for the next vignette and the unmistakable tones of John L. Lewis. Hello, everybody everywhere. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. 1940. It was an election year, a big one, for a man was seeking the first third term in American history. There were many voices in protest, and none was louder than that of John L. Lewis. In a moment, a vignette of John Llewellyn Lewis from the Old Scotchman Scrapbook. $1940. This was the year that everyone in the country was singing, "You Are My Sunshine." 1940. The fabulous 40s. At the Broadway Theater one night, George Jessel was making his weekly radio broadcast sponsored by a nationally famous hair restoring product. Just as Jessel was telling the world on the microphone that the hair restorer would make bald heads bloom like fragrant gardens, George's wig fell over his nose and gagged him, and he had to stop the commercial. And this year, Leslie Howard gave one of his rare bad performances on Broadway in Hamlet, prompting Robert Benchley to ask a friend Did you see Mr. Howard in the petrified Hamlet? Another time, Benchley went to review the opening night of the play White Cargo, featuring a beautiful star whose acting was not up to her beauty, as the sensuous Tondaleo. At one point in the middle of the play, the seductive star uttered the dramatic words, "Me Tondaleo, me good girl, me stay." Whereupon the unquenchable Benchley arose from his seat and in a loud voice said, "Me Benchley, me bad boy, me go." And during the presidential election of 1940, John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers had some language even stronger than Benchley's as he lashed out at Franklin Roosevelt's desire for a third term.
Personal craving for power, the overweening, abnormal, and selfish craving for increased power is a thing to alarm and dismay.
In 1947, Lewis and his mine workers were fined for the second time by a federal court. John L. Lewis was never really a Roosevelt fan. And here, like the voice of doom, he comments on Roosevelt's desire for peace.
The president has said that he hates war and will work for peace, but his acts do not match his word.
That was John L. Lewis, who, outside of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, possessed the most unmistakable voice of the 20th century. In a moment, news of the next vignette. From the Old Scotchman scrapbook has come a vignette of John L. Lewis in the 40s. In these early years, a young, unknown golfer, whom other professionals regarded as too little to win, was beginning his move, Ben Hogan. This is the Old Scotchman, Gordon McLendon. Listen for the next vignette and another memory of the campaign of Wendell Willkie.